Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
This week in 1940, London was burning, as it would for 58 consecutive nights. By the end of the German blitz, 8 months, 1 week and 3 days later, huge parts of Britain's industrial heartland had been devastated.
As many as 200,000 British people, overwhelmingly civilians, were dead or wounded. Whole streets were wiped out. Shipyards, factories, railway infrastructure, and even Parliament were badly damaged.
And yet, we never did surrender. When Mr. Churchill told his cabinet colleagues, many shifting uneasily in their chairs, that not until he and they lay there on the cabinet room floor, choking on their own blood, would they succumb, he really meant it. One man, Lord Alan Watson, CBE, has specialised in this endlessly fascinating subject. And he has a new book, Churchill's Legacy, 2 Speeches to Save the World. And I'm glad to say he joins us now on the Sputnik. Lord Watson, welcome to you. We'll come to your book and the matters therein in a moment, but as this is the anniversary of the beginning of the Blitz on London, when Londoners, despite this extraordinary bombardment, by and large, kept a stiff upper lip, kept calm, carried on, and never dreamt of surrendering to the slaughter. How much of that, in your view, was due to the leadership of Winston Churchill?
Churchill was decisive. I think one of the reasons he was so important was that it was unimaginable to him that Britain would surrender. And certainly Britain would never surrender unless they were beaten to the ground, beaten to pulp. And you quoted what he said to his cabinet members, many of whom were not very happy to hear that.
Definitely shifting uneasily.
Very shifty, yes. You know, putting on their tin hats. But the fact is, he was absolutely confident in the ability of the British people and of Britain to resist. And that's, of course, what they did. The other thing is his rhetoric, his speeches. There's no doubt that the speeches he made in 1940 had huge impact. And they're, of course, world famous, and everybody knows them. Fight on the beaches, fight in the streets, and all that. And I think people were, having had no real leadership, not knowing what was actually going to happen, suddenly to hear this voice making it absolutely clear that the determination was there, I think it was very important.
For people like me, or someone specifically like me of part Irish, left-wing, it's very difficult for people to understand my admiration for Churchill. My stand is that whatever he did before, or for that matter, whatever he did afterwards, if not for that moment and that stand by that man, well, we'd be conducting this discussion in German, and the entire history of the world would be completely different.
Yes, and he knew that he was standing at that pivotal point in history. He was well aware of that. And you remember, he said that I feel that the whole of my life has been a preparation for this moment. And so indeed it was. So he knew what the odds were. It's not that he was romantic about it. I mean, he'd looked into the abyss. He knew what could happen. But he was absolutely determined. And I think his ability to communicate, the speeches that he made, and as you know, I've been writing about the speeches after the Second World War, 1946, they play a huge role in the world. And UNESCO has now actually recognized these speeches as being testaments of freedom, equal historically, if you like, to Magna Carta and other things.
So George's admiration for Churchill is such that we have a large picture of Churchill in our dining room wall that is next to Che Guevara and Ho Chi Minh. But it's unknown, really, amongst the left. And I just wonder, why do the left hate him so much, apart from him being a Tory?
I don't know that the left really does hate him so much. I mean, the fact is, one of his most stalwart allies in 1940 was Ernie Bevin, the trade union leader. And historically, if you look at the debates in that cabinet, which were so decisive in June 1940, the Labour Party's support for what he was trying to do was absolutely clear.
She's talking about people to the left of Ernie Bevan.
I know that.
But it's true that he had a very checkered past, but let's not take up more time on that, because I want to turn to your book, which is a terrific volume, and it's here and in the United States.
Yes.
And it's dealing with just 2 speeches after he had left office, when most people think, well, Churchill really finished in 1945.
Yes. There's a huge human drama here. I mean, Churchill leaves Potsdam, and there it is, you know, there's an apocryphal story, which you will allow me to tell, I suppose, that when he left Potsdam, Marshal Stalin said to him not to worry because, as he said, I have never lost an election. So there we are.
That was true.
I think that was true. But the fact is, he fell from this great height. He expressed it in terms of altitude. He dropped from 38,000 feet to ground level. And his morale was absolutely shattered by his election defeat in 1945, which he brought partly on himself. I mean, he did not fight a good election campaign. But the fact is, he was out, and he said to Lord Moran, who was his doctor, it would be better that I were dead. And he also said, the flies are gathering on the corpse. His morale was shattered. And then this extraordinary thing happens. He's sitting in Chartwell, and his aide-de-camp puts a letter in front of him from a college that nobody actually had heard of, Westminster College, Fulton, Missouri. And the bottom of the letter, it invites him to go there, get an honorary degree, make a speech. And down the bottom, in handwriting, from the new President of the United States, Truman, is this sentence which says, this is a fine college in my home state. If you come, I will introduce you. And Churchill immediately thinks, that means 18 hours in a train with the new President of the United States. So, of course, he accepts. And the speech is made, and it is highly dramatic. And what Churchill was saying in the Fulton speech, it's now known as the Iron Curtain speech. But if you really look at the speech, he's actually saying a very interesting thing. He's saying peace is possible, but peace has to be in Europe. Peace has to be based on a recognition of equality and a respect. And that means strength, because the Russians respect strength. And indeed they do, they have it, and they always have. And so what he was arguing was that America and Britain ought to make it clear to the Soviet Union that they had a position and they were going to stand on it, and if there was any intrusion into Western Europe, there would be real trouble. And at that point, of course, the United States had a nuclear monopoly. It didn't last very long, but they had it. And so that's what he was proposing. The speech was hugely controversial in America. The Roosevelt family didn't like it at all. And when Winston left New York, there were 4,000 demonstrators saying, no war, Winston, you know, things like that.
I would have been one of those.
You would have been there with your placard.
Indeed.
I have absolutely no doubt. But anyway, he sails away. And the drama then really unfolds. It's extraordinary. Inside the Tory party, there were people who really wanted him out. And Lord Salisbury was one of them, and of course Anthony Eden was desperate to get him to number 10, you see. And they were going to give him a dinner party and say, well, Winston, great speech and all that, but, you know, what you really ought to do is make speeches like that, not lead the opposition in Parliament, which is boring. Really, and you know, Anthony's here, and he's very happy to take over. And of course,
this afternoon,
yeah, this afternoon, and the sap has risen, you see, and the controversy has sparked him, and so he's already said the ship is delayed by 4 hours going into Southampton, and by then he's already said to the media, I am going to fight the next election, you see, and I will get Attlee out of Downing Street.
Wow.
But then he makes this second speech 6 months later in Zurich, Switzerland. And what I hope is an important contribution to the history out of what I've written is that I've made the connection between these two speeches, Fulton, Missouri, and Zurich. Now, why? When Winston was in the United States to make the first speech, he had a second task, which the British government had given him. And they were saying to him, for God's sake, Winston, persuade the Americans to renew Lend-Lease. We're broke, we're bust, the damage that you described at the beginning. We've got to restore it. they must give us some money, they must lend us money. And he got nowhere with that, absolutely nowhere, despite all his networking on the Hill and everything else. They all said, absolutely not. And I think because he was half American, he got what the Europeans would have to do if they were going to untap American generosity. And that was they had to actually get their act together themselves. So in Zurich, he gets up and he says, it's wonderful, you know, he's got this solemn Swiss audience in front of him, and he says, I shall startle you. We have got to have a kind of United States of Europe, and it has to be led by a partnership between France and Germany. September 1946, Nuremberg trials going on. Can you imagine?
Amazing.
De Gaulle goes apoplectic. Apoplectic. It's just as controversial as the first speech. But the truth is that, in a way, you can say that these two speeches kick-started a process, and I've argued that, one of which leads, in effect, to NATO and the Western Alliance. But the other leads, perhaps more significantly in the end, historically, to the coal and steel community, to the Marshall Plan, and to all of that. So these are speeches to save the world. Indeed, to the European Union.
I'll tell you what, I would be a taker for a United States of Europe. I campaigned against the European Union, but I'd be a taker for a democratic, elected United States.
Me too, we both do that.
Lord Watson, you're a fascinating man. It's a fascinating book. The very best of luck with it, and thanks for coming on the Sputnik.
Thank you so much.
Coming up next, when Adam and Eve ate the apple against instructions, we all know what happened next. When Ireland took just a little nibble at the apple, well, don't miss it.
Welcome back to Sputnik. The right-wing government in Ireland is in a real pickle over Apple. Sweetheart tax arrangements made with the giant multinational Apple Corporation have been ruled by the European Commission to be illegal state aid and have ordered the sovereign government in Dublin to recover a staggering 13 billion euros from Apple, plus another 6 billion euros in interest.
It is just one of the Irish minority government's many crises and may yet bring it down.
Joining us now is the General Secretary of the Connolly Association, Michael Carty. Michael, welcome on board. James Connolly, after whom your association is named, would be turning in his grave, wouldn't he, at the idea that the Irish people were led by a government that said to a giant multinational corporation, actually, we don't want your tax money and we're going to fight anybody who tries to make us take it.
I suppose from James Connolly's perspective, I think what would have riled him more would be having an external force, a force outside of Ireland, not accountable to any of the taxpayers in Ireland, telling the Irish government how it should run its taxation policy. It's not a competency of the European Union. The European Commission has no place in telling the Irish government to do that. And this essentially is a power grab by technocrats in Brussels. It's happening in a wider political context, the post-Brexit context, for example. But I think from Connolly's politics, that external interference in the affairs of Ireland would have been something that angered him more.
Well, he would curse both these things, wouldn't he?
Yes, obviously.
He'd curse the fact that Ireland was so craven towards a multinational corporation that it allowed them to operate on its soil and didn't levy a proper rate of tax on them. And, as you've just said, denounce the supranational dictating by the European Union.
We are no big fans, obviously, of Brussels either. But this is, in fact, they're quite right on this position, right? It is really ridiculous.
It is a paradox, isn't it, Michael? We campaign to leave the European Union. But on this, the European Union's right and the sovereign government is wrong.
It's quite a difficult question in that, look, 19 billion euros, the 13 billion plus the interest, would obviously be of enormous value to the people of Ireland, especially when they've been laden with 64 billion of banking debt by the European Union. They've gone through a massive austerity project, but people shouldn't be misled into thinking that this 19 billion is going to appear in the form of new hospitals or services that have been cut being reinstated.
Well, it could if the Irish people elected a government that was of that mind.
It could, but I And the Connolly Association would defend the right of the Irish government to appeal against a decision of the European Commission in an area where the European Commission doesn't have the competency to do that.
With all respect to you,
Yep.
I'm not sure you're right about that. The European Commission is right that Apple was acting both as a resident and a non-resident participant in the economy in Ireland. So I don't think any appeal will be successful.
My understanding, and this is just from having a look at the briefing papers produced by the Oireachtas in Dublin, is that the Irish government recognised that there was a mismatch in the taxation arrangements for Apple between its tax status in America and in Ireland, which led the company to be stateless. You know, which is
Not even a flag of convenience.
No, it's something that's essentially.
They didn't even treat Ireland like Liberia used to be treated by the owners of tankers.
That's it. It's an incredible arrangement and something any transnational monopoly would seek, an arrangement like that. Now, the Irish government claims to have addressed that in legislative terms to ensure it won't happen again. But I think the key issue is, and it's a difficult one, as I say, because of the question of this money that people think is going to sort of rain down on top of them in Ireland now. You have the fact that the decision's been made abroad, where there hasn't been, the European Commission doesn't have a competency for taxation. Okay, now it desires one, and it pushes for one. It doesn't have a competency for that. Also, the fact that the profits which this taxation supposedly arise from are derived from other operations. And in the Commission ruling, it says that other countries can claim their portion of those taxes, including America, other EU countries and US countries. So when it isn't actually profit generated in Ireland, but it's derived from abroad.
Well, you know that Apple has something like 300 billion euros in the bank, never mind its assets as a whole. They could pay this money without noticing a dent in their bank statements.
For me, and I have zero sympathy for the Apple Corporation. Yes. I'd like to make that clear to you both. Absolutely no sympathy for them. But the issue here for me as an Irishman and as a Democrat is who decides what levels of tax are paid in Ireland. And that should be the Irish people.
Well, of course, Ireland is responsible for its own tax rate, but the Commission has ruled that this was in effect state aid, that transfer pricing was in play, and that basically the company was running rings around all taxation jurisdictions, and with the connivance of a right-wing government in Ireland. But you're right to point to this very weird dichotomy that you, the Connolly Association, as an anti-capitalist organisation in your bones, Connolly said that running a green flag up over Dublin Castle without changing anything else would be no independence at all. What we've got is a green flag with a green flag government that actually acts as a slave to the multinational corporations.
There's a huge difficulty with how Ireland is governed and the nature of the government there at the moment. Now, as I say, I would never be, and the Connolly Association wouldn't be in the position of living in Britain and telling people in Ireland what type of government they should elect, be it left-wing or right-wing. But the fact of the matter is the Irish state at the moment is quite dependent on foreign direct investment, to the point of almost of no return without radical change. And that comes about from Ireland's colonial history. It comes about because of the partition of the island. It'd be very difficult to establish, for example, a protectionist economic model when you've citizens living in an occupied territory who would effectively be punished by it. And now, by membership of the European Union, which of course Ireland was coerced into being a member of through the Anglo-Irish Free Trade Agreement and a secret clause later acknowledged with Irish Taoiseach that forced Ireland into the common market. And Ireland then comes into a position where it's entered a second active union. Both active unions have destroyed what little industry the country had, and is now in a position where even to beg for foreign direct investment, that you have an outside force again saying to it, look, you're not allowed to do it your particular way.
Well, what's the impact of all of this going to be on the Irish political scene? It's a minority government, a very unpopular one. Everything from water pricing to the collapse of the National Health Service due to the austerity imposed by the European Union, insisted upon by the European Union after the crash, and so on. Is the government going to survive, and is there an alternative on offer for the Irish people?
Like another Irexit, following the British Brexit?
Well, I think Irexit, as it's becoming known, is
First time I've heard that.
is really the only plausible option available now. You have a situation where, at the moment, even before Article 50 has been invoked here, and from the association we believe it should be as soon as possible, but you have a situation where Ireland, the Irish state, the south, is within the Eurozone. It does 2/3 of its trade outside the Eurozone. So it does 2/3 of its trade with a currency that it has no influence over the value of. When Britain leaves the European Union, it'll do 2/3 of its trade outside of the European Union. It's the only country in that situation. Ireland is now a net contributor to the EU. So any money Ireland receives back is only Irish money being recycled through Brussels. We pay for a few technocrats along the way. We lose billions in fishing industries and major political issues in Ireland that there's mass mobilisation around at the moment. Opposition to water charges, opposition to bin charges, the campaign against homelessness, to build social housing. All of these things are restricted, if not dictated, by European Union directives. Mass surveillance of email, Irish parliamentarians having to run private member bills past the European Central Bank to check their economic competence before they're put to the Irish Parliament. All of these issues are it's the elephant in the room when anything to do with Irish politics has been discussed. It's going to have massive implications for the peace process. Brexit will, if it isn't followed by our exit. Huge implications.
This would paradoxically, of course, 100 years on from Easter 1916, bring Ireland back closer to Britain. That's another of the many strange dichotomies in this story.
It's extremely strange in that we've had the entire nation celebrating 1916 and the centenary of the proclamation of the Irish Republic, talking about unfettered control of Irish destinies, the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland, and yet an issue like the European Union isn't being discussed. When we look at, say, future Anglo-Irish relations in the context of post-Brexit, you have a situation where, following the end of the Cold War, you had the space created where the British military didn't need to control Northern Ireland as the Atlantic route to Europe. You had the peace process, the Good Friday Agreement, follow on from that. Now, if you have a situation where Northern Ireland remains in the UK, but outside of the EU, the South is in the EU in an ever-increasing common security and defence policy, there will certainly be interests in Britain in maintaining a foothold in Ireland for security reasons. It's the amount, all the different levels to this debate now. It's, as I say, incredibly complex, but for Ireland, economically, politically, and in terms of Irish unification, the only option is to leave the European Union. The European Union now is one of the most strong fetters to Irish unity, and it's an incredible thing when that is rarely discussed. In relation to the issue.
I'll raise a glass of water to that. Michael Carty of the Connolly Association, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So our show on Churchill stirred up quite a debate on social media. We had, as we expected, lots of left-wing people, really hating him, just like our Glass Gallock Singh. He says, up till their deaths, my Dundonian World War I veteran grandparents would spit at the mention of Churchill's name.
Well, in Dundee especially, because he was the MP there and he got thrown out. His car was overturned and he promised to see the grass grow on the streets of Dundee, so he's hated there.
On Ireland and Apple, David Beckham 4PM says Ireland gave up oil rights and agreed with Apple £500 tax in every £1 million. Ireland is going backwards.
Although, as was explained, we are here in a gigantic paradox. The European Union is correct to say that allowing these kind of sweetheart deals will merely create a race to the bottom and then eventually a race out of the European Union by these companies altogether. At the same time, did Ireland rise and fight for independence in order to be dictated to, not by London, but by Brussels?
And that's all the tweets for today.
Which alas means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on social media, on Twitter at @RT_Sputnik, or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.